Mr. Speaker, this budget 2013, I think, has to be seen against the background of its predecessors, the economic challenges facing New Zealand, and in particular the quite extraordinary challenges facing other developed economies of the OECD. And shortly after the Minister of Finance introduced this budget into the House, like trade ministers from New Zealand over the last 10 years, I had the privilege of representing New Zealand at the OECD ministerial meeting. So going from New Zealand, where I think there's growing confidence, Mr. Speaker, that we are indeed on the right track, to going into the heart of Europe, and the heart of the problems of the Eurozone was very striking indeed, Mr. Speaker. To say that the mood was sombre would be considerably understating the case. I mean, forget the outlier countries, the countries in serious trouble, like Greece, Portugal, Spain. We just got news on the eve of the OECD ministerial meeting that the unemployment rate in Sweden, a country I'm sure that most members of this House would consider one of the most cohesive societies in the world and successful, youth unemployment of 25.1%. 25.1% youth unemployment in Sweden, with riots taking place in Stockholm as a result of frictions that this inevitably causes. So I think people just need to wake up and smell the roses here when they sit down and see the enormous progress that New Zealand has made under the superb leadership of the Minister of Finance, Bill English. And I had the privilege of speaking to a leader of one of these countries who asked me, well, Mr. Grosser, what are the big numbers in New Zealand? And I said, well, the big numbers, Prime Minister, are these. We have growth of 3.1%. We have inflation of 0.9% and zero on food prices. We have unemployment still higher than we want, but trending down and currently at 6.2%. We have seen household income rise 20% in the last 4 years, and our debt, and remember this, that the average debt to GDP, gross government debt to GDP in OECD countries is well over 75%, many of them above 100%. We're trending just above 30 at the moment from memory, and we will be back below 30% in a year or two. And we will return to surplus in 2014-2015, which has been much improved by the latest statements coming out of the Treasury a few days ago. This Prime Minister said to me, my God, he said, I wish we had numbers like that. And I bet that most of those countries would wish that they had numbers like that they wish that they could tell their people, their young people, that there is a future for them in their countries. And the achievement of this government is quite considerable. And I sense a growing realisation in New Zealand that we are turning the corner. And when we set this against the background of the numbers that we inherit, just let me reel off a couple of them. Inflation November, you can check it yourself if you think it's a lie. Inflation to November 2008 was 5.1%, 5 times the current rate of inflation. We had budget, huge debt growing, because the Labour Green government of the last 3 years lost the plot completely, just throwing money at every problem that arose in the belief that this would solve the problem, and no prospect of returning to surplus at all. Not even a date out there. No prospect of returning to surplus. When you think about the turnaround between those two sets of numbers, and also factor in, Mr. Speaker, the extraordinary additional challenges of the biggest natural disaster that hit New Zealand for 70 years, costing $40 billion, the collapse of our finance companies through the greatest financial crisis in the last 70 years, Mr. Speaker, I think this budget and the achievements of the Minister of Finance and his senior colleagues in steering New Zealand to this position is nothing short of remarkable. When I look at this budget, just pick out a few issues at random, look at the position of health. And I think it's important to look at these issues given the absurd critique that somehow this government is focusing on. What do they call it? Rich mates? Isn't that the rhetoric that is used? Rich mates? Let's just look at the fact. This is a national-led government, and we're working for the nation. Let's just look at some of the data in this year's budget to uncover the real truths here. In health, a portfolio that Minister Ryle has handled with outstanding professional ease. It's extraordinary the way that Mr Ryle has managed to move this whole debate forward in such a positive direction. We've allocated, over the next 4 years in this budget, $1.6 billion additional dollars for dementia care, for more elective surgery, for a better treatment of diabetes and more screening for adult health. We've allocated an extra $900 million, carefully targeted at early childhood education, at primary education, at social education. And for poor families, just to return to the theme of the absurdity of this critique, trying to look after rich mates, when we are interested in all New Zealanders, particularly people who are hard-pressed by economic conditions. First thing is, as we believe absolutely, and all the empirical evidence tells us, the most important assistance you can give somebody is a paid job, and we've created 50,000 of those new jobs in the last 2 years. We're going to insulate a further 46,000 homes, mostly for people in low incomes, because the evidence tells us that warm homes are a crucial ingredient to the health and the education performance of young children in low-income families. We're going to allocate $21 million additional dollars to deal with one of the childhood problems, rheumatic fever, which has plagued these people over many years. This is what this government is interested in, all New Zealanders, the nation. But this hasn't been a budget just conceived in its own. We've also pursued a rigorous plan through the business growth agenda. Now, much of this, Mr Speaker, has been implemented through previous budgets. A look at the fantastic tax reforms, fiscally neutral tax reforms introduced in 2010 budget by the same Minister of Finance. And we can see the benefits of this already coming through, Mr Speaker. The figures that came through in terms of fiscal balances this week showed increased tax revenue as a result of the structural changes the Minister of Finance introduced under some of the most difficult economic conditions that the world has seen in 70 years. And we will see also, as this economy continues to move in the right direction, the effects of incentivising middle-income New Zealand to the point where 75% of New Zealanders are paying the top tax rate of 17.5 cents. We're going to see these structural policies that we've introduced over the last 4 or 5 budgets start to impact on New Zealand's long-term and medium-term prospects. And all of this has been done under a coordinated plan called the Business Growth Agenda, which covers, broadly speaking, Mr Speaker, 6 headings: innovation, capital markets, skilled and safe workforces, management of our natural resource base, more effective use of our infrastructure and investment in it, and close attention to export markets, the portfolio obviously of greatest interest to me in terms of the government's structural plan. And we can see elements in Budget 2013 in moving forward all of these agendas forward. Let's just look at innovation, for example. This budget has allocated an additional $96 million for further investment in public services. We're going to invest $106 million over the next 4 years in research and development assistance to business and new startups. So I think, Mr Speaker, that this budget is placing New Zealand, as with its predecessors, in an excellent space, so that in the second decade of this 21st century, New Zealanders can look forward with great confidence to a future in this country. And finally, to conclude, Mr Speaker, I'm going to award first prize for the most ridiculous comment made in the context of this budget to the co-leader of the Green Party, Dr Russell Norman, or as I call him, Dr No, since he's opposed to any policies that would raise growth or create employment. And you may recall that Russell Norman likened our current Prime Minister to Rob Muldoon. Now, having been in the Prime Minister's so-called think tank for 3 years, 2.5 years under Muldoon and 6 months under David Lange, I actually, unlike an Australian schoolboy, know Muldoon's personality. And Mr Speaker, I would argue that I've never met 2 people more unlike than John Key and Robert Muldoon.
Andrew Williams.
Thank you, Mr Speaker.
I'd like to, on behalf of New Zealand First, welcome